When you start living in Italy, there are going to be some things that take you by surprise. Maybe because you've never heard of them before, or maybe because they are done so differently to what you were used to. This was my experience back in 2018, and some of those things that took me by surprise 6 years ago have now become second nature to me. They are normality. But I realise that I'm in quite a fortunate position to be able to say this, because when you first step foot in Italy and start your new life, these things can really confuse you and make you feel pretty stressed. So I want to start recording more of these types of videos where I share with you the things that once took me by surprise but have now become normality, so that you can better educate yourself on those aspects before you arrive here. So today's video is going to focus on the 5 surprising things that you'll encounter when you start working here in Italy. Now, the first thing that's going to surprise you when you start working here in Italy is going to be your contract. Now, in Italy, there are 2 main types of contract. You have a fixed term contract, which in Italian is a determinato contract, and then you have a long-term contract, which in Italian is an indeterminato contract. Now, for the majority of professions, there are always exceptions, but for the majority of professions, when you first start working at a company, you will be given a fixed term contract, so a determinato contract. This has always been my experience. I have taught English in the private sector for the entire time that I've lived here, and whenever you begin with a company, this is usually what they do. Now, there are a few downsides to this in my opinion. Whilst you can set your life up very easily with a determinato contract, I did it back in 2018, it does give you a sense of insecurity, because I don't know about you, but if I don't have a sense of security, I'm stressing about, what happens if they don't renew my contract? What's going to be my next job? What am I going to do? Here's Tina, she wants to be part of the video. So for this reason, it can be quite stressful to be given a determinato contract at the beginning. And it might be something that you're not used to as well, because in the UK, when you start working, normally you are given a long-term contract unless you specifically apply for a temporary position. So to be given a fixed-term contract from the offset for a normal job feels pretty strange. So you do need to brace yourself for this. But coupled into that is the fact that when it comes to contracts, what you are given to sign is not necessarily going to contain all the information you need to know about your job. So in the UK, when you are given a contract, it contains everything: the terms, the conditions, the role, the responsibilities, the works. And when you sign that document, you are 100% clear as to the job you are agreeing to do. Here in Italy, it's a little bit different. Usually the contracts that you are given to sign are maybe 1 or 2 pages maximum, and they just outline the basic role and responsibility of your job and your pay and hours of work. So they are very, very basic. And the reason for that is because there is an external document, which is an extension of your contract, a national contract, for most professions here in Italy, which you need to locate on the internet to be able to read the remainder of your contract. So those other terms and conditions that apply to your role. And this also includes things like notice periods, particularly if you want to leave your job. You have to go and reference an external document to be able to fully understand what you're signing. So this is something for me that's very strange, because I'm not used to having to go and do research on my contract. I'm used to having it presented to me at the time of signature. So that's something else that you need to brace yourself for, absolutely. Now, when it comes to contracts as well, it really does depend where you live in Italy, because a lot of people will say, especially if you live in the south, you're very lucky to be in possession of a contract. Now, it is true, there is a lot of work that kind of goes on behind the scenes, a few backhanders, shall we say, because people try to evade paying tax. But essentially, a reputable company will always give you a contract. So you need to consider that. People here, especially in the south, a lot of them do things that they shouldn't have to do, primarily because of need. But you should always be given a contract, especially if you are living here as an expat, because you need that contract to often secure your visa requirements to live in this country if you have no other means of supporting yourself financially. So this is really, really important. Contracts are a myriad of things. They're not always accurate. Even contracts that have been overseen by a lawyer sometimes contain things that are a little bit fabricated. So my biggest piece of advice to you will be to make sure that you get your contract translated. Even if your Italian is pretty decent, contracts can be confusing here. Make sure you understand everything that you are agreeing to do before you put pen to paper. This is super, super important. Now, you might be wondering, why do most companies here begin their employees with a determinato contract and not an indeterminato one? Well, I think it's because with a determinato contract, there's more flexibility for the employer. It's easier to say, okay, that person's not good for our company, goodbye, than it is to do that with somebody who is on an indeterminato contract. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons why that is in the next surprising point. And this is extra payments. Now, I'm really not used to this coming from the UK. It's very rare in the UK for companies to give bonuses to their staff. Only if you work for an exceptional company would you be lucky enough to have this. I used to be a police officer, so you can imagine my pay was fixed. I didn't have the fortunate possibility of having any bonuses. But essentially, here in Italy, there is a thing that you can have maybe 14 months worth of payments in a year. It really depends on the company. There's a bit of a fine line here as to what is the correct thing to do. But if you have a proper kosher company that you're working for, you actually get 2 extra payments every year, one in the summer and one in the winter. And that is the equivalent to a month's salary. So it's like in the summer, you'll get 1 month where you have a double salary, and in the winter it's the same. And this is actually, I think, pretty fantastic, because the wages here in the south especially are pretty low. Like, the average national wage is around 1,200 euros a month after taxes, which by the time you consider taking off housing, rent, whatever you pay for, plus, food and living costs, it's pretty low. So, having these extra payments twice a year can actually help people, particularly because they fall at 2 of the most expensive times of the year, the summer and Christmas. So that is actually a pretty good thing, which doesn't exist in the UK. So that's going to take you by surprise for sure. However, brace yourself, because not every company kind of implements this in the way that they should. Some companies only give you 1 extra payment, and that payment may very well be split out across the month. So you end up with maybe, 100 euros extra per month in your paycheck, rather than receiving a double payment in the summer or in the winter. And some companies don't do this at all, even though they should. So you really have to be a bit flexible when it comes to contracts here. Not everything is done as it should. Not everything is black and white. There are a lot of grey areas. So brace yourself. But I think this payment is actually pretty amazing. Something else that took me by surprise to do with payments is that when you close your contract, so whether that is a determinato contract or an indeterminato one, if you decide you don't want to work somewhere anymore, you actually receive a payment for the closure of the contract. And this is nothing to do with like any holiday you're owed or your final payments for the hours you've worked. This is completely separate and independent. This is to close the contract down. Now, the amount you take usually depends on the amount of time you spent working at the company, and there are some other factors as well that you have to consider. But generally speaking, this is usually the equivalent of a month's salary for every year that you have worked at that company. And that can run into the thousands of euros, particularly if you've been working at a company for like 5 or 6+ years. It's pretty incredible. And again, something else that doesn't exist in the UK. In the UK, your final payment consists of any holiday you're owed, the hours that you've worked, and anything else that needs to be calculated into that. But there is no end of contract closing payment. So this is something else that's going to take you by surprise. So it's pretty interesting actually to see this happening here, because I'm going to be honest and I'm going to say I think this is a huge waste of money. I think rather than people being given this money when they close their contracts, people here in Italy should be given a higher wage overall for the work that they do. I see people here who close their contracts and walk away with over 10,000 euros just for the closure of the contract. It's absurd. Like, I really think that money would be better spent increasing the national wage for everyone, because there isn't technically a national minimum wage. Yes, maybe in certain professions there is an amount that should be paid to people, but there are many people that don't work at that level. And so I really believe that money should be reinvested in other ways to improve the pay rate for many people that work here. But there we go. This is how it is here in Italy, and it's something that I can't really understand, but it's going to take you by surprise when you learn this. And it's another reason why I think that a lot of employers choose the determinato contract route for as long as they can, because something to note about this, you cannot be permanently given a determinato contract by the same employer. At some point, usually I think it's after 2, maybe 3 years, sometimes it can be longer. It really depends on how dodgy your employer is. But at some point that has to be converted into an indeterminato contract. You cannot permanently work for somebody on a temporary basis here in Italy. So there is that aspect as well. But I think as well with the determinato contract, there are less fees involved when the contract is closed compared to an indeterminato one. So I think this is the reason why employers prefer to go down this route first and foremost, in case they're not sure about the work that you're going to produce. The third thing that took me by surprise about working here in Italy was to do with bank holidays. Now, in the UK, if a bank holiday happens to fall on a weekend, so on a Saturday or a Sunday, it's usually carried over to the following Monday. So you end up with this lovely long weekend situation in those cases. Here in Italy though, it's completely different. If a bank holiday falls on a weekend, you've lost it. It's not recuperated, it's not transferred to the following Monday, it's just gone. And I think that's really strange to get used to, particularly if you kind of enjoy the thought and prospect of a long weekend. However, there is something quite positive about working here in Italy in the sense that there are a lot more religious holidays, which means days off for you as a worker here in Italy. Now in Italy, those public holiday days are known as red days on the calendar, and you can actually go onto the internet and Google Italy's red days. And these are the public holidays in Italy, and a lot of them are actual religious celebrations. But aside from the red days for the whole of Italy, you will also find regional red days. So essentially, every single part of Italy, there is a patron saint that covers that particular area. So here in Palermo, the patron saint of Palermo is Santa Rosalia. Now, every single July, on the 15th of July, it is a red day here in Palermo, which means that all the businesses will be closed. If you're working in an office or something similar, you won't have to go to work. The schools are closed. It's a regional holiday for this particular part of Italy. So it is this. It's always based on where you work as well. Even if you live in Palermo, if you live in Palermo and you work in a different part of Italy, it is not a red day for you. It is only a red day if your place of work is within that particular region. So that's something else to consider. But there are lots of extra holidays that exist here in Italy that do not exist in other countries, certainly not in the UK anyway. So you have to get used to that as well. The public holidays may not correspond to what you're used to as well. So I don't know if this might impact your ability to go back and see family, for example. So there are lots of different things that you need to think about, but I think it's really interesting to note the differences that there are when it comes to public holidays. The fourth thing that took me by surprise is when it comes to annual leave or holiday leave. Now in Italy, this is very much company dependent, but the majority of Italians are given their holiday leave in August because we have the festival of Ferragosto, which is like the end of summer festival, which usually happens around the 15th of August every year. And as a result, Italian people are given their holiday in that month. Now, there are pros and cons to this. Pros because summer is literally the worst season to be working in here in South Italy, especially because it's just so darn hot. But the cons are that everybody has the time off at the same time, which means that everywhere is busy, everything is expensive, and you've got all the Italian people off as well as the influx of tourists that typically come at that time of year as well. So it's not really my favourite time to be in Italy, if I'm really, really honest. And also, like, tied into that is that August becomes a bit of a dead month as well, because so many businesses choose to give their staff this holiday in this month and some close completely. You find that if you want to get something done in August, it can be very, very difficult sometimes because so many places are closed for holidays. So this is something that could be very different for you depending on where you come from. Certainly in the UK, this doesn't happen. We don't have like complete months that shut down, and we don't have companies that make sure that their staff take holiday at the same time every year. Like, there is flexibility depending on the company in the UK, and people can take holiday leave throughout the year depending on their needs. Now, it does happen like that also here in Italy. People can still take holiday at other times of the year. It really depends on the company you work for, but some companies basically only give their staff the time off in August. So that's something else that you need to consider. And the fifth thing that took me by surprise when I started working here is what is known as the Sette Trenta. So this is your income tax return in Italy. But you might be thinking that your employer takes care of that. Well, no, there's actually something you need to do as well. So essentially, usually in the kind of late spring, you are given a document from your employer that details all the money that you have earned in that year. Now, with that document, you need to go to either the CAF, which are some of the offices that you can find here in Italy that help you with legal matters, employment matters, administration, bureaucracy. They are there to help support you with these kinds of things. So you either need to take your document there, or you need to go online and you need to complete your own tax return. So what you need to do is you need to submit the information that is on the document your employer has given you, as well as any other expenses you have made throughout the year. So consider, if you pay rent here in Italy, that is a deduction that part of that, not all, but part of that can be considered as a deduction from your tax return. So it might mean that you pay a little bit less because they consider the amount that you pay for rent when they're calculating the amount of tax that you owe. Now, also combined within that is if you have to pay for medical expenses, if there are certain things that you have to pay for relating to healthcare, then those receipts that you have kept throughout the year can also be added to this or calculated at the end of the year to also give you a further reduction on the tax that you need to pay. This for me is a little bit antiquated because in the UK, that kind of stuff never falls to the employee to deal with. Only if you run your own business are you responsible for dealing with this kind of paperwork. When you are an employee, that is managed solely through the company and their accountants. And so it's really, really strange to have to deal with this because once you've completed this, the documents are submitted back to your employer and then they handle the repayments, usually through your salary, or any kind of reimbursements as well, usually through your salary. But you have to do some of that work yourself. And that to me is a little bit strange because you don't expect to have to also act as if you are kind of self-employed when you have a working contract and those kinds of things in place. So you have to brace yourself for this. This is an important thing you must do every year in order to ensure that you're paying the right tax and that you don't owe a lot of money at the end of the year. Something to note about Italy, they're very quick to take the money back and a lot slower to give it back to you. So essentially you can expect that if you owe money, the very next month it will be taken out of your salary. And if you're waiting for money to be returned, you usually have to wait until the January of the following year to receive it back in your payslip. You see how that works? So essentially, these are some things that can really take you by surprise when you start working here in Italy. Can be very, very different to what you're used to. And so I hope that this video has opened your eyes a little bit to the reality of what it can be like to work here. If you want to explore the world of work a little bit more, I suggest you watch this video right here where I share with you the ugly truth of working in Italy because it's not all it's cracked up to be. I will see you in the next video.